Hello, everyone. My name is David Bernstein. I am President and CEO of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs. JCPA is the network hub of 125 Jewish community relations councils in 16 national organizations. We are very delighted to host this important discussion and very exciting yet trying times for Israel and in the Middle East. And I couldn't think of a better person to have this discussion with than Einat Wilf. Dr. Wilf is the co-author of The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. She's a leading Zionist thinker and a foreign policy thinker. She was a member of the Knesset from 2010 to 2013, and she served as chair of the Education Committee and a member of the Foreign Affairs and Defense Committees. She was born and raised in Israel. She served as an intelligence officer in the IDF, as a foreign policy advisor to Shimon Peres, and as a consultant to McKinsey & Company. She has a BA from Harvard. She has a PhD in political science from Cambridge, and she's the author of 6 books. So as you can see, she's very, very well qualified to talk about these exciting new agreements and a number of other issues that will come up, I'm sure. I'd also invite you all to ask questions in the question box, and we'll do our best to get to as many as possible. Einat, thank you for being with us. We really appreciate you spending time with our group. So we've seen we've seen these Abraham Accords signed on the White House and with the UAE and Bahrain. I think many of us were extremely surprised, pleasantly surprised when these agreements came out, and we've been still trying to make sense of them. Tell us what is the meaning of these agreements? Why did they come about now?
So these agreements are the culmination of a long process of a realigning of various interests in the region. So first of all, it really started with the so-called Arab Spring, which did not turn out to be very springy, and which led a lot of countries across the Middle East to view Israel as a country that is stable, that is a solid ally, and a country that gets it. Of course, there are interests of countries in an alliance against what they view as a threat coming from Iran. And I think there's also a long arc of exhaustion, of just feeling that for decades, the Arab world has held itself, has backed the Arab-Palestinian cause against Israel and Zionism. And I think over time, this kind of blank check backing for Palestinian rejectionism began to appear for some countries, especially against other interests that they have, as just not a good use of their resources.
Got it. So you're in Israel, and you're no doubt feeling the atmosphere there. What is the atmosphere in Israel around these 2 agreements?
So generally, there's very high support for these agreements. I mean, how can there not be? They're not only agreements with 2 more Arab countries, they feel very different than the previous agreements. The previous agreements with Egypt and Jordan were very important agreements in ensuring that there's no more war. Jordan, the Egyptian and Jordanian military have been responsible for some of the greatest loss of life in Israel, and having a peace agreement with them was very important on that end. But after 25 years with Jordan and more than 40 years with Egypt, I can assure you that those agreements do not feel like peace. Jordan and Egypt made every move in the past decades to send the message that they are not our friends. Egypt is the #1 distributor, producer, and promoter of anti-Semitic content across the Arab world. Jordan and Egypt together in international forums are the ones that spearhead various initiatives against Israel. There's no tourism, almost no commercial relationships, no really people-to-people diplomacy. What we have with the UAE and Bahrain is true normalization, not just peace in the sense that, I mean, they never sent armies against Israel, But what they are doing in many ways is even more important, because normalization in the Arab understanding of the conflict was always the greater crime. Making peace with Israel, as long as it was understood to be mostly about cessation of hostilities, was a problem, but still okay. Normalization was always perceived as the greater crime. And what Bahrain and the UAE are doing is committing this greater crime of normalizing relations with Israel, with the Jewish people, and doing it warmly, happily, in a way that shows that they're not being dragged kicking and screaming. It's not just about interest. They've really had it, and they want to move on in the region.
Right. So we've known about sort of these ties for quite a while, informal ties, Israeli officials traveling back and forth to Gulf countries and having secretive meetings and American Jewish groups going and reinforcing the ties. And whenever we would ask Israeli officials like yourself, well, when is this going to be true peace? We would hear, well, it's going to hinge on the Palestinian connection. And yet now UAE broke that. Why? What happened between a few months ago when we were still told that it wasn't going to lead to peace, and now in these peace agreements?
So first of all, there was still a need to pay a certain price on the Palestinian issue, and the whole annexation debate provided it. So by Israel promising to not move forward with any form of annexation, even of a small share of the West Bank, that cleared the path for the UAE to have open, normalized relations with Israel. So something did have to happen on the Palestinian front, but it's true that it's not what people had imagined. It's merely not doing something. It's not actively doing something. But in many ways, this reflects what we've been hearing for quite some time now from many countries in the Gulf, where they expressed their keen interest in having open, normalized relations with Israel, and were asking Israel to just do something that will allow them to move forward. And with the non-annexation, they basically got it. So they got something that allows them to still appear, at least, as if they have not completely sold out the Palestinian cause, and do what they wanted to do for a very long time, have open, normalized relations with Israel. I will say that right now the UAE is even going further, and some of the things that they're telling the Palestinians are things that no European would dare say. They're being much more harsh in telling the Palestinians, guys, we've had it. Move on. I think the Palestinian reaction of burning Emirati flags created a tremendous counter reaction in the Emirates. I see it all around my Twitter feed, where they're basically saying, this is your response after we supported you for so many decades. You know what? We've had it with you. So in many ways, you're even seeing a harsher, more extreme relationship with the new open, normalized relations with Israel towards the Palestinians.
I want to come back to the Palestinian side of the equation in a second. There's been a lot of talk about yet further countries opening ties with Israel, normalizing ties with Israel. I've heard Oman. Where do you think, what's next here? Saudi Arabia obviously would be the big prize. What's next?
There's certainly now a kind of effort on the Israeli side and on the Gulf side to create a feeling of a domino effect. So to make more and more countries join, so as to finally cement the idea that the old conflict is over, that the old Arab-Israeli conflict, where the entire Arab world boycotts Israel, stands behind the Palestinians, that conflict is over, and this can very well happen. The Palestinians on their side are trying to stop this domino effect. They've gone to the Arab League, which for decades was their safe space. That was the one place they could be sure that they would get blanket support for whatever they wanted. And the Arab League basically told them what we call in Hebrew, go search. I mean, you know, these are sovereign nations. This is not what the Arab League used to say. It was basically saying
Right.
the UAE is a sovereign nation. The UAE can do whatever it wants. If the Palestinians don't have the Arab League backing, other Arab countries are going to see that, and they're going to see that there are no repercussions. Everyone's watching each other. So other Arab countries are watching the response of what was famously known as the Arab Street. And they're seeing that the Arab Street, there are many in the Arab Street who are embracing, happily embracing this relationship with Israel. And if those countries will begin to realize that they no longer have to pay a price in the stability of their regime by normalizing relations with Israel, that the Arab League is not going to go against them, then we are likely to see other countries follow.
We've heard reports that that the Emiratis are very interested in the religious dimension, the interreligious dimension of this, of expanding ties between the Muslim world and the Jewish world, and using it as an opportunity for that dialogue. Is that something that Israel's keyed into, and is that a possible formula for expanding ties with other countries in the region as well?
Certainly, the conflict always had numerous elements, national, religious. So there's no doubt that what the Gulf countries have is the ability not just to speak for Arab identity. Even UAE as a small country punches way above its weight. The high rises, the universities, the UAE is a symbol of what is an Arab future. And the UAE and other Gulf states also speak in the name of a Muslim identity. You see them talking about them being moderate Muslims, them speaking about anti-Zionism reflecting extreme Islam. It's something I've had a lot of discussions with Emiratis recently. They constantly represent anti-Zionism not as a Muslim imperative, but something that is brought by extreme Islam. And they present themselves as being against that, as being moderate Muslims. They even just recently changed their school book. See how quickly they do that, to say that supporting Israel is the true Islam. So those countries are interested in retelling the story, not just in terms of the Arab identity, but very much also in terms of the Muslim identity, and making themselves as representatives not just of an Arab future, and part of that Arab future is warm relations with Israel, but also of the Muslim future. And they want to claim that the Muslim future is a future of moderate Islam, not of the extreme Islam of the Islamic State, and certainly not that of Iran, for example.
Okay, so we know this didn't land well among Palestinians, or among certainly the Palestinian Authority, I gather with Hamas as well. And the question we have is, ultimately, do you feel that this will moderate Palestinian politics or make them dig in to their intransigence even more on negotiations with Israel? Are we likely to see the Palestinians say, we've lost our ability to isolate Israelis, so we might as well give up that leverage and now let's come to the table? Or are we likely to see the very opposite in them just shutting down?
In the short term, they might shut down, but over time, they will definitely have to moderate. At the end of the day, the ability of the Palestinians as a small people to sustain decades of war and terrorism and rejectionist positions against Israel always was part of the fact that they had the backing of the Arab world. Because they were perceived as the vanguard of an Arab and even Islamic civilizational battle against an invading foreigners, Zionists were presented as colonialist invading foreigners like the Crusaders rather than an indigenous people who belonged in the region. So as long as the Palestinians could count on the support of the Arab world, they could sustain a very strong rejectionist position. They could go into negotiation after negotiation with Israel and keep saying, no, 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 because they knew that they had backing. If they are forced to contend with their actual size as a small people who have backing only of some countries, but mostly do not, you are almost guaranteed, I mean, nothing is guaranteed, but there is a very, very high likelihood that you will finally see the emergence of a Palestinian leadership that tells its people it's over. It's over. Our 100-year war against Zionism is over and should be over. The Jewish people are indigenous. They're not foreign invader colonialists, and we have to share the land with them. So we need to sign an agreement where we divide this land and stop insisting on things like return. But such leadership can only emerge through a difficult and painful process by which Palestinians will have to contend with the fact that they no longer enjoy the backing that they did for so many decades.
So while these agreements have been met with great enthusiasm for much of American Jews and the vast majority of Israelis, I'm sure, there are people who are saying, wait a second, maybe this will enable the far right in Israel to continue with an expansionist agenda. Maybe this will enable settlers to believe that they don't have to give up anything, and that it'll actually make it harder for Israelis to reach an agreement with Palestinians because they believe they didn't have to give up anything for peace in the Arab world. That is an argument that I'm hearing and from some prominent people. What is your response to that?
It has no relationship to reality. First of all, the rejectionist side in this conflict for a century is the Arab Palestinian side, based on their notion that they are 50, 60 times bigger than the Jewish people, and they do not need to make any compromise, which is why they have rejected every chance at dividing the land, reaching a compromise, and having their own state. No one ever seemed to criticize the fact that the world, so much of the West and the Arab world for so many decades, allowed the Palestinians to continue with the rejectionist stance. Israel, if anything, is very keenly aware that at the end of the day, we're a small minority. The Arab world is 50 to 60 times our size. The Muslim world is over 100 times our size. We are keenly aware that the Jewish people are and will always be a small ethnic, religious, national minority in an Arab and Islamic Middle East, and that our future depends on ultimately the Arab and Islamic world accepting our presence as equal and legitimate. So if there is a real opportunity at peace, we will say yes. At the end of the day, all you have to do is look at the facts. Every time that the Arab world came to Israel with a genuine offer of peace, and as I said, even in the Arab and Jordanian case, much less, Israel said yes. Israel said yes. Israel gave up vast territories, resources, removed settlements. Even now, Israel said yes to the request by the UAE to stop annexation. Ultimately, even when we have a strong military, we behave like the minority that we are. And we say yes to compromises, not because the Jewish people don't have their history in Judea, because at the end of the day, it's among the Arab and Muslim world that we need to live, since our ancestral homeland is now in the midst of an Arab and Islamic world.
So here's a question from a viewer. What was the role of the Trump administration in the process, and how important was it?
How was the role of what? I'm sorry?
The Trump administration in the process.
The Trump administration?
Yes.
I think they had a very interesting role. I don't know if it's whether by design or instinct, they understood the Middle East. And that's not something that could be said of the previous administration as much as they had good intention. President Trump and his administration, as I said, whether by instinct or by design, they got the Middle East. They understood the importance of the various power relations. They understood what's important. And the most important thing they understood was that the Palestinians were actually not the underdog in this conflict, that the Palestinians were the ones that were holding everyone hostage, literally. So they moved very quickly to demonstrate that they, the United States, understand that by defunding UNRWA and various other elements and moving the embassy to Jerusalem and recognizing the Golan Heights and basically telling them the message that they sent was the message that other people got throughout history and the Palestinians did not yet receive, the message of move on, the war is over. And I think what Arab countries saw was that this message did not translate into the Middle East going up in flames, which is what many people wrongly predicted. Quite the contrary. So this set the stage for a realignment. The fact that the administration was also harsher on Iran brought the Gulf countries and Israel closer. The fact that this administration made it clear that it had Israel's backing. Ultimately, Arab countries want to make friends with someone that is powerful. Israel's ability to project power, not just its own militarily, economically, but with American backing, is the one that got other Arab countries to say, that's the country we want to be friends with. And we see that the Americans didn't pay any price for finally telling it like it is to the Palestinians. So we can probably do the same, and there will not be a price to pay. And they were right.
Right. Great. So there's been some questions, and I had a question as well, but it certainly interests our viewers here about the EU response to all of this. You had suggested earlier that the Europeans have been telling the Palestinians that they better get with the program. How are we to understand the European response in its entirety?
I wish the Europeans would tell the Palestinians to get on with the program. If anything, they've indulged them for decades in their belief that they're the underdog, that they don't need to do anything, that they are still refugees from a war that ended 70 years ago, which is why generally what you're seeing from the EU is this very curmudgeonly response. The EU always liked to see itself at the forefront of forging peace. Their premise was Israel is the problem, Israel needs to be pressured. Comes this American administration, which I'm sure you know is not beloved by the Europeans, and they say, no, Israel is actually not the problem, Palestinian rejectionism is the problem, we're going to take care of that. And by the way, coming up with a decent plan for 2 states, which is what the Europeans say is necessary for peace. So I think a big part of it is the messenger. They don't like the fact that it's happening with this particular president, and with the fact that it undermines what they said was the road to peace. And someone basically telling them, you're wrong, there's another path to peace. And I don't think anyone, and they certainly likes being proven wrong.
So another question from the audience. You know, we know that this was brokered by the Trump administration. How do we think a Biden administration might proceed with peace talks? Do you have any sense or any feelers about the Biden campaign and how it would if it was elected, obviously, how it would act differently or the same?
So here I think we are also seeing a bit of the race. There's a race to sign up more countries under this administration, not just because that President Trump wants all these photo opportunities for an election. From the Israeli perspective, and I think also from the Arab perspective, especially those countries that want normalization, they want to cement this new paradigm before a Biden administration, because there is a risk, not of Biden or Harris themselves. I think they generally get it. But we already hear from people around them that there's a desire to kind of go back and continue to indulge the Palestinians. They're talking about bringing back the funding for UNRWA, bringing back all the structures that sustain the idea that in the conflict, Palestinians are the underdog, and it's the responsibility of America to somehow prop them up against Israel. And because Arab countries know that this is not true, I mean, the beauty of what's happening right now is that Arab countries actually know what the conflict is about. They don't buy all the lies that have been fed to the West over decades. They know that it's been about their Arab rejection of Zionism and the Jews as an indigenous people. So they know that ending the conflict means reversing this paradigm, and they have no interest in an American administration going in and going back to propping Palestinian rejectionism. So I think the more Arab countries we're going to have normalized relations with Israel, the more likely it is that a Biden administration is just not going to go back to the previous paradigm. We're still in a moment where it's not certain. The more countries that we will see normalized relations in the next month or 2 or 3, I think a Biden administration, if they do come in, they will say, okay, Golan Heights. I don't see them reversing these things. They're certainly not going to go to Arab countries and say, undo your relations with Israel because more needs to be done for the Palestinians.
So Iran continues to be part of the equation. It was one of the driving forces for this agreement in the first place. And yet we wonder what might be the impact on Palestinians. Will the Palestinians look for a new sponsor in Iran? Not that Iran hasn't played a role, but even a stronger sponsor from Iran, and end up in the Iranian court? And could we see actually a exacerbated conflict between Israel and Palestinians, because the Iranians are the only people left who support radical Palestinian action? What is your, and this is based on a question that I received.
So first of all, of course, the Palestinians are going to go look for a new sponsor. They're not immediately going to come to terms with the new reality. They're going to try to change it. That's what they did when they lost their Soviet sponsors. And that's when they began to seek the European and American sponsorship in the late 80s and the early 90s. So of course, they're going to look for a new sponsor. They're going to try to get it among European and American administrations to the extent that those are sympathetic. And they might try to get it with Iran, but that might conflict with their desire to get the support of sympathetic European and American governments. If they're left without American and European support, without Arab support, and all they're left with is to go for Iran, here I think a lot depends on Iran's situation. Is Iran in a position to sponsor the Palestinians, or is Iran under so much pressure and domestic difficulties that it's not much of a priority? So even for that, it's important that Iran does not have the capacity to underwrite Palestinian rejectionism more than it already has. But there's no doubt that long before the Palestinians will come to terms with the fact that they need to accept Israel's presence and legitimacy as a sovereign Jewish state, they're going to try to postpone this painful reckoning by searching for new sponsors, and they will only go through this reckoning if they're truly left alone.
Great. So with all this good news for Israel, you would think that things are great, and Israel's facing all positive developments. Yet we know better. We know that it's a challenging time in Israel, as it is everywhere. We were talking before this about COVID and Israel going into lockdown right before Rosh Hashanah. Tell us what the situation is with COVID and how that's playing out in Israel and Israeli politics.
In the plainest terms, it sucks on so many levels. I mean, we did so well in the beginning. We were one of the first countries to realize the risk, to take the necessary steps, to pull together. We showed solidarity, a sense that we're good under emergency situations. But I guess what was really laid bare is that we're not very good in careful, specific, day-to-day planning. Certainly Netanyahu himself, you can see it in these agreements. He loves being the prime minister of grand things, big agreements with Arab states. He even liked fighting Corona when it was a huge affair. But as soon as it became this day-to-day matter of managing testing and following and schools, you could see that he's intensely bored by that. He was very happy to go sign the agreements. He was very miserable to come back and to deal with the day-to-day lives. But Israelis feel that. Israelis feel, and that we are boring him in that sense, that our daily lives and problems are not the things that he wants to place his attention. And it really feels terrible, because there is literally no objective reason we should be in this situation of having to go into a second lockdown. The sense of trust among people that our government is doing the work necessary is basically gone, and it just doesn't feel great right now.
So amid all that, also there's been sort of an ongoing political crisis in Israel, and we're hearing about another round of elections, which God forbid would drag Israel through another crisis. Tell us, what is the status of the political situation in Israel?
At the moment, I mean, politically, there's still this ongoing crisis situation, which brings together many issues, but generally is focused on the fact that we have a sitting prime minister who in parallel is being indicted for corruptions of bribery and basically not fulfilling the public trust. But and that feeds into the whole political situation. We're also generally equally balanced between both sides, making it very difficult to reach a conclusion one way or another. But and this also, of course, feeds into our inability to take the necessary, specific, day-to-day, boring steps to handle the virus. But right now, the virus shadows everything. Barely anyone thinks about politics, to the extent that people are happy, and they are happy about the agreements with the UAE and Bahrain. They kind of notice it, and then they go back to thinking about the coming lockdown and how unfair it is. So right now, this is all that we're thinking about.
Right. One thing I find fascinating is comparing and contrasting how the various cultures deal with these measures. In America, we have sort of a movement, anti-masking movement, that is, contests the very idea that COVID is a major problem. Is there any major constituency in Israel that is denying the importance and the need to fight COVID in a serious way? Or is there consensus on that in Israel?
There's no major kind of, in general, conspiracy theories do not take hold by and large in Israel. It's a small society. The idea that there is this faraway government doesn't work in a society where literally everybody knows people. But there's definitely a complete breakdown of trust that the government knows what they're doing and that the government has our best interests in mind. So when people are going against what, government decisions, people are saying, we're going to rebel against this lockdown, we're not going to fulfill it. They're not doing it because they think, virus or it's not a problem or people are dying. They just don't feel that the government knows what it's doing, and there's a bit of a sense of every person to themselves, while recognizing that the challenge is very real.
So we are in America. Many of us have been involved in supporting Israel over the years. What can we do today to support Israel, especially in light of these recent accords? How can we play a constructive role in supporting Israel?
So I think the greatest opportunity right now is to embrace normalization. One of the most interesting things that happened on campuses recent years was the elevating of normalization to this absolute taboo. Don't normalize Israel, don't normalize the occupier. It was all part of this thing that, there used to be a time that you could actually sit on a panel with other Palestinians and discuss the conflict. But then over the last years, it became the thing that, no, there's no symmetry between occupier and occupied. There's no symmetry between perpetrator and victim. It was part of this representation, not as a conflict in which Palestinians are an active part of the conflict who know what they're doing and what they're fighting for, but just as this defenseless, completely innocent victim. And normalization, as I said, historically in the Arab world, normalization is the greatest crime. On American campuses, normalization was made a terrible crime in recent years. I think now we have a great opportunity to embrace normalization in the spirit of what the UAE and Bahrain and hopefully more countries will be doing, to say, no, people who oppose normalization with Israel, whether in Iran or on a university campus in the US, belong to the past. It's the people who do want to normalize relations with Israel, who embrace the Jewish people, that's in the reports themselves, who embrace the Jewish people as belonging in the region, as making the region whole. Those are the people that we should elevate. So I think as many events, activities that could be done under the idea of normalization of relations between Arabs and Israelis, Arabs and Jews, Muslims and Jews, and inviting Palestinians into that and saying, look, this is the future that could be yours. No, it's no more about rejecting Israel, hoping to push it out. We are embracing the sovereign state of Israel, the state of the Jewish people, as a state that belongs in the region. You can have a state next to Israel, but stop hoping to have your state instead of Israel. When you accept that, you too can take part in the celebration of normalization. I think this is the great opportunity. Now, it's not just about helping Israel, it really is about bringing peace to the Middle East.
That's very powerful, and I'm sure we're going to be talking a lot about that. How can we play a role in helping foster normalization, the idea of normalization? Thank you very much for that. Thank you very much for this tremendous analysis. You're such a powerful voice, and we're lucky to be able to hear it. So we will continue to talk to you and look forward to the next opportunity. Hopefully we'll be able to check in a few months, and we can talk about even more countries that have cut ties with Israel, have developed ties with Israel, and a broader peace. So thank you very much. Now, thank you to all our viewers. We hope that you'll consider supporting the JCPA so that you can hear more of these great webinars in the future. Take care, everybody. Shana Tova.